Well, good morning, everybody. First animation today looks at some radar data over the last 12 hours. And one of the storm systems that came out of the eastern Great Lakes really outperformed some of the model forecasts. You can see it right here in the animation. These storms that came out of parts of like Lake Huron into Erie and then clipping parts of Michigan, but then dumping a tremendous amount of rainfall in Ohio in the overnight hours here as these storms kind of slowed down, not a whole lot of flow to push them out, but there was abundant moisture in this area. So we just watched this complex of storms. It did produce some straight line wind damage last night, but what you've got here is just some incredibly heavy rainfall. Now we're going to keep an eye on where these storms are expected to go later today, but as we do that, we'll also be watching what's left of Harlod go right over the four corners here. We're going to see Harrod's moisture eventually get pulled into Colorado, out into parts of Nebraska and Kansas, and really dump quite a bit of rainfall. But the overall ridge that's been in place here just continues for another few days because it's already been around for several days, going all the way back to late last week, bringing in its heat and then really setting up this whole pattern we're dealing with. That's the one that guided Hillary. It pulled Harlod underneath. It's keeping Franklin way out to open ocean here. And in the middle, it's been incredibly hot, very humid, and the heat indexes have been quite high. We'll talk more about that in just a few seconds. One last thing before I get away from this, you can see all the flecks of color here in parts of like Iowa and Illinois. Watch the end of the animation, which is early this morning. Like I talked about yesterday, we had more beam ducting last night, and we're clipping the tops of the wind turbines with the radars here. That's what you're seeing. All right, last 72 hours of total accumulated precipitation. Look how much came out of this storm system here. Now this has got a 2-hour lag on it, so we're going to continue to see these values go up as you just saw in the radar. But we did have places in here picking up 3 to 8 inches of rain, especially right here around Lake Erie. And again, some severe weather. This is Harrod's path over the Rio Grande and now moving toward the Four Corner states. And a lot of this is just flow around the ridge, but some of this is the remnants, what was left of Hurricane Hillary. And again, we were talking about the Blue Mountains getting a lot of precipitation out of this. There has been 1 weak shortwave that did move in to Washington, delivering some rainfall into this very dry corridor here in the Willamette Valley, getting up to Seattle. So I'd love to see that, but just amazing to see the true nature of this large ridge. Now this is what it's going to look like later today. You can see we have a couple of short waves hanging out here. There's one that's rolling over the top in the Canadian Prairie, but the ridge is the most dominant factor. And we've been kind of questioning how long it's going to be around, and we've watched the models try to kick it out, but I want to show you kind of a new way of looking at that. So one of the things I ran this morning was NOAA's high split model. And I went back 10 days on where the air came from above my head here. I stayed the night last night in Iowa City. And what I trace it back, you can kind of see here that it's kind of been looping around this ridge. It was over here well before Hillary came through. And then before that, if you kept tracing it back, 10 days before this, it was way out in the North Pacific Ocean. Now, it's where it is today is right here. And what I want to show you is where it's going. Now, if that ridge were stuck and we were in really, really big trouble if it did get stuck, you would see this upcoming forecast just continue to keep it spinning around in this region. But instead, the forecast, now it changed map projection on you here, or at least the view. It's expecting what's here to eventually get pulled out east and roll all the way out into the North Atlantic. And that means the flow is not going to continue to just rip this on around, leaving it in this area for a while. So let's go have a look at the latest update on that to kind of see how this pattern is going to break down. First thing I want to show you, though, is this. We have got this Pacific North American pattern, which is right now neutral, going way up here to an index value of 6. And that means we're watching a major pattern change happening in the west. And what that's going to promote is the breakdown of that ridge and the retrograding of it toward the Rocky Mountains. But this doesn't last long. And you can see that the PNA dives right back down here by the time we get into the beginning of September, and then possibly hangs out around neutral or goes negative. Now, what does all that mean? This is a view. This is another way of looking, an index that follows the behavior of these troughs and ridges. Now remember, whenever I show you these maps, the ridges represent where there's heat and high pressure, and the troughs represent where there's cooler conditions and low pressure. Sometimes it's tropical in nature, like here, and sometimes it is just those troughs of colder air that have their source regions from the upper levels of the atmosphere or from northern latitudes. Now, the other thing I want you to do with this is you can always just follow the contour lines, and because of the geostrophic wind balance, that's the direction the wind's going to go, all right? So you just kind of follow it, and you can see that it's going to curl like this, or it's going to roll over the top of the ridge. You can kind of see how that flow sets up. So this is the ridge, and here are all the weak little short waves that are curling around its periphery on its western side. Now, as we saw, the PNA is going to go very positive, and that is because of this. by the time we get into this weekend, we end up getting, as we've talked about all week, this high over low pattern. So that pulls the ridge axis back to the Rocky Mountains and allows much cooler air to dive into the eastern half of the country. And that cooler air is sourced around this deeper low that is here north of the Hudson Bay and the Canadian archipelago. Now, normally when we see a high over low setup like this, we worry about it getting stuck and blocked. But this has already had a bit of a break to it. So you can see there is flow coming over the top. Some of it gets pulled around like this and stuck in this low, but this is not stacked straight north. Not necessarily north-south, but maybe a bit more southeast to northwest. It's already broken over by the time we get into Sunday. So it means it doesn't last there very long. So this is next Tuesday into Wednesday. And what that does is that takes this deeper trough of cooler air, which is going to prompt some wetter conditions in the southeast up to New England, and starts to just shove it out. And as it shoves it out, we expect more ridging to come back into the mid part of the country. It may not be here until Labor Day or a little bit beyond that, but what this means is we're going to transition back over into a warmer pattern. Now, speaking of warmer pattern, yesterday I got a tweet from Susan David. Love following her. She's brilliant. She does some great work in the commodity space. She's a good one. But she asked me this question. She says, Snodgrass, is that 150 a typo? So I went in here and I clicked on the map that she showed, which comes from Oklahoma. And what she was referring to was the heat index, that's the map here, and this 150 that's right in this area. So did a little digging, just trying to get a response back to her. So I went to the webpage, sure enough it was there. So then I pulled off the surface observations. And it turns out that there was a station, a weather station in southeast Iowa that for some reason, and I don't know why, because it didn't match any of the surrounding weather stations, had a temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit and a dew point temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So you start to look at that, and those are heat index values that aren't just 150, but like 160, 170. And what's interesting about this is if you were out walking through corn, remember corn at this time of year can evaporate 4,000 gallons of water into the lower atmosphere every day. That's what we're seeing right now. Now this is not in the middle of a cornfield, of course, but I'm just telling you that these heat index values, if you were out there doing some sampling, you could be experiencing heat index values that are that high. So it's really just amazing to see that. But the actual temperatures yesterday, as you see here, we're up from Texas all the way to this part of South Dakota over to Iowa. We had a lot of hundreds and a lot of deep 90s that stretched nearly everywhere else around this. And I was watching very carefully the upper level moisture pattern just to see if there was deep column, of moisture in this. And certainly there was. This animation is looking at water vapor, and it's satellite derived. And what you can see is the very dry air that's been pulled in on the backside of Harlod, which is here. And these were the storm complexes last night we watched blow up over parts of Michigan, getting into Ohio. So just kind of a beautiful animation to see how that's playing out. All right, I'm recording this at 5:50 this morning. I hope this gets uploaded quick. My internet here at this hotel is terrible. But this is the overnight low temperatures. So take a look. Quad Cities 80, Des Moines 82, 87 is the morning low temperature in the south. Actually, this is for Omaha. Just incredible to see how warm it stayed last night. And our all hazards weather map reflects that. You can see a broad area is still under excessive heat warnings for the remainder of today, and the heat is going to be on for another day at least. But there is some change coming, and I'm going to show you the high-res NAM model. And what you're looking at here is temperature. Not apparent temperature or the heat index. This is just the forecasted model 2-meter or 6-foot temperature. Now, if you look very carefully, you'll see wind barbs in here as well. And as I play this from early this morning through about 9 a.m., you can see the rain-cooled air over parts of Ohio. But what you're going to see later today is these temperatures cranking way back up there. And if you notice my color bar, this shade only shows up in the upper 90s into the low 100s. So again, this afternoon, much, much warmer air. But if you notice here, the trajectory of the wind is like this here and like that. Well, not that whole trajectory. It's like that here and like that there. So there's clearly a change coming for the northern plains, upper Midwest, that's going to eventually build into the Midwest. But watch this later on this afternoon. The NAM, this is just in the model world here, tries to blow up some storms over parts of like Kansas and Missouri. So do you see that this tonight? The model's tossing those storms up, and therefore it's got this large area of rain-cooled air. Throughout this summer, I talked about the difference between convection allowing models and then models like the European or the GFS, which don't. They parameterize it. The NAM is a convective allowing model. So it thinks there's going to be big storms here tonight. Now, we're going to look at another way to kind of assess that, and we'll, of course, watch what the National Weather Service says and then the radar, but it is suggesting that we could get some storms blowing up in this heat down here. Now, you see the cooler weather that's running along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains? That is from what was left of the storms this morning over Ohio. But what I want to get to is this is through Thursday into Friday, and now do you see on Friday that the heat is much farther to the south by Friday afternoon? And then we keep playing this into the overnight hours. Watch the storms that is projecting blowing up all along that frontal boundary. See it there? Isolated south, but a lot of storms right on this frontal boundary. Then we get into Friday night and into early Saturday. And we'll park this out there at 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. There's a cold front coming through. We've been talking about it for several days, and it's going to suppress and press that heat all the way down here back to the south, meaning no relief from the heat here, but relief from the heat in the midsection of the country. So the easy way to look at it is just to step like day by day and look at what these temperatures are going to do. So this is today on Thursday's highs. There's Friday's getting into Saturday. So you can now see the front diving through there, lighting up some storms in this area. It lasts into the weekend. This is Sunday. Getting into Monday, you notice the heat building back into the Pacific Northwest, staying across the south, but returning to normal, to cooler than normal temperatures across a broad section of the country here from the central U.S. to the northeast. There it is on Tuesday and Wednesday. Now, you know that we've been talking that to start the month of September, we expect these temperatures to warm back up again. But remember, September is a transition month. It's the beginning of our fall transition. So to be hotter in September is not the same as being hotter in August, and certainly not in July. So as you watch these temperatures, this is your next 5 days. Let's play it out there, day 5 through 10. That's the cool down we expected as the high or low sets up here and the ridge builds back over the Rocky Mountains, but then it's going to open back up again. And as it opens back up, we see the models pretty convincingly showing that that first week of September has a lot more warmth that comes from the central plains of the United States through the Great Lakes. Cooler air seems to be here, or at least near normal temperatures across parts of the Southwest and California, even into the parts of the Four Corners states. So what we'll be watching for when this heat is done is any change in this map. Now, I use a data set called Prism to make this. It always has a 2-day lag on it. So we're not yet collecting the heat from the past 2 days. This only goes to the 22nd. So once we get that information in the Prism data set, we'll look and see where our accumulated stress degree days are end up being. I think it's going to be an important metric to gauge the health of the corn crop, specifically right in this area. That's really the only area in which it applies. I guess I could include more of Indiana and Ohio with this. So that particular area is where if you get above 140 stress degree days, according to some research by Dr. Elwin Taylor, we could start to see some significant yield loss in corn. So we'll watch that again. But I do want to show you something. I don't often run these maps for such a short time period, but going back to the 18th of August to the 23rd, these are temperature ranks. So it just shows you that the size of this ridge, when you look at 131 years worth of data, it's the hottest. Okay, so for that stretch of days, the 18th to the 23rd, total temperature average. Okay, we were everywhere there's a number 1. It's been the hottest. So we'll see how this pans out as well when this is done. All right, back to the precipitation side of this. Today, again, this morning, we're watching the same region, and we will be seeing if storms do pop up here. But also note, the front's coming through, so there is the risk of some pop-up storms a bit farther to the north here as well. Tomorrow, when the front lines itself out right in this area, we're going to keep an eye all the way from the Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas, really North Carolina here, stretching all the way back through the border between Kansas and Nebraska for some storms. And I showed you the temperature forecast, so here's the precipitation forecast. So throughout the day today, we see the storms moving into parts of New England. What's left of what's in Ohio moving through parts of eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, and possibly ending up down here tonight in northern Georgia. We see what's left of Harlod rolling up into parts of Colorado out of Utah into Wyoming. And I know it doesn't look like much, but these were the isolated storms the model produced that cooled the air down. You can also see here the storms that are coming into parts of the northern plains tonight. So playing into tomorrow, we continue to watch these storms spread east. You then get into late tomorrow afternoon and evening, and there's the frontal boundary stretching, connecting one system to Harlod. So we're going to see storms all along this boundary and possibly a few more across the upper Midwest, but maybe some very heavy rain coming out of Colorado, which again, as we saw yesterday, is having its wettest year on record in this area. So more rain coming through. The model actually is trying to toss out a little mesoscale convective vortex, maybe using some of the rotation of Harlod, what's left, to spin this one up again. And we'll keep a close eye on that, see if that slows down and dumps a lot of rain. The latest update from the WPC puts a large area of Colorado with a pretty good chance of grabbing more than an inch to an inch and a half of rainfall. But outside of that, the storms are east. They're going to build into the Carolinas late in the time period. And we're watching very carefully this system that's coming out of, well, it's actually coming out of the Pacific, crossing Central America, and maybe coming somewhere toward Florida in the longer term forecast. So this is the update I've got right now from the WPC. I want to back it up with the European model. So let's just go have a look at total accumulated precip. As we play this forward, again, you can just see the isolated storm complexes rolling around the edge of that ridge. So isolated storms in here, easily capable of producing brief downpours and potentially some severe kind of elements to it. Here's the heavier rain from what's left of Harlod. As we play it out, there are better chances of storms in the northwest, parts of the northwest. But then what I'm watching is this. Now, this is the operational run. This is next Tuesday. You can see that it's attempting to bring something here between Cuba and the Yucatan, and if it does, it could interact and get into the southeast. Now, before that happens, heavier rain is expected in the Carolinas, and that's because of the opening of this ridge, allowing a trough to get in here and pull some of the better flow over this part of the country. Now, some probability maps. What are the chances of the next 10 days of getting an inch? That's what you've got here. So you can see those wetter corridors. But on the drier side of this is the probability of getting less than half of an inch. So again, we're seeing the influence of this ridge and the drier air that follows it into the central United States. All right. From there, though, let's go ahead and have a look at the tropics, because this is new. We've now seen the National Hurricane Center last night upgrade this area to a 40% chance of development, and then it kind of hops over Central America, and now they're watching this area very carefully. Now, Franklin stays out to open ocean, but does strengthen here on the warm water that's in this area, but we think it will not interact and hit the United States. But the probabilities here are interesting. So here's Franklin, here's whatever is out in the open Atlantic, and it's all moving around the Bermuda High, which is closer to the Azores than it is Bermuda. But this is the guy right here I want to watch. So you now see that the model probabilities of getting a tropical depression, this is just the forecast probability of getting a tropical depression, is above 70%. And we see that the forecast is pulling this, possibly toward Florida. So this is just something we're going to watch again tomorrow. We'll watch it early next week. Keep an eye on this one, okay? From there, last couple of things to talk about. Week 2 precipitation. The air that's following this cold front, after it drops in some storms in this area, is a bit drier. And we see the ridge reopening, so we see the forecast models continuing to paint this area over dry. Now again, I hate to say it, but the GFS has not got a clue about what could be coming out here at some point next week and then what follows. So we're seeing wetter conditions in the southeast out of this into Florida, but a bit drier farther to the north. Models have been pretty consistent with the wetter pattern here to finish August and start the first week of September, though. So we see that quite consistently. One last thing to show you today. This is the international update real quick. Indian monsoon really shut off early. It's normally going this point and goes into September, but very, very dry here in central India. There's more wet weather coming out into parts of China, but the North China Plain and Manchurian Plain are forecast a bit drier. Notice Europe, quite stormy pattern throughout parts of Europe, but Ukraine into the Russian wheat belt here are drier. But my main focus going forward is this moisture that's expected to come into Brazil. This is very early. The monsoon typically doesn't really get going until we get out there, past mid-September, really into the beginning of October. And a lot of this is not monsoonally driven. The moisture is not necessarily the full-on monsoon, but this would be some early rain. And that would be very critical early rain for the success of the start of the South American growing season. So that will be very front of mind for us as we go forward, because September 15th gets here and they put the pedal down to get the crop planted. So a lot of things to watch internationally, but just want to bring up to speed with what I know today. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll talk again tomorrow. Thanks.